Alistar pays less mana for his mayhem. Lucian's pursuit is more relentless, and we're putting jungle creeps on the clock. Welcome to patch 412. Hey guys, Miss Pudding here to walk you through the changes we're making in patch 412. We'll kick things off with a TLDR before getting to our panel to cover a few topics in depth. Today's topics are the new jungle timers, Lucian and Alistar. To skip ahead, check out the video bookmarks. Okay, let's get into it. Essence Reaver and Bloodthirster got some changes to cement one as an offensive mana restoring item, and the other as a defensive life-stealing Bloodthirsty item. Next up, Kassadin's been running rampant with his crazy mobility and control. Rather than hitting his iconic Riftwalk, we're tweaking a few other things to reduce Cass's late game power so he doesn't just continuously punch you in the face. Similarly, Lucian's getting some changes to highlight his strengths while giving him real weaknesses. He'll be dashing a lot more often, but in exchange, he'll have to get a little closer to deal damage and stay effective. Alistar now has lower mana costs and an early buff to his ult, but junglers take note, his passive no longer deals double damage to monsters. This patch also comes with jungle timers. In the scoreboard, you'll find red, blue, dragon, and baron timers that'll automatically update if your team has vision of a camp when it's killed. Finally, we've got a few more champion tweaks. Ahri's Q costs less mana and scales slightly better than before. Kha'Zix is getting a buff to his Q, and Ezreal can now buff himself with Essence Flux, but only if he can get in front of it while it's midair. Okay, so that's the gist of patch 412. To talk about these updates, I'm joined by Nome from Game Clarity team, Statikk from Live Gameplay, and Snoopeh from Evil Geniuses. Hey guys, thanks for coming out. Sorry, you all nodded in unison. What is this?
We're just acknowledging it.
All three of you at the exact same time.
Say
Do the
Yes,
same thing. So I'd like to start a discussion with the addition of jungle timers that are visible in the scoreboard now. Why did we add those in the first place?
Yeah, so we knew this was going to be a really controversial feature when we started working on it. And it's controversial not only to players, but also internally, because we've literally been debating this feature for years, right?
Yeah, I feel like we talked about this 3 years ago.
Yeah.
Been on Reddit for a while.
Yeah, and you know, really when it comes down to it, and we sat down and thought about what our design values are, we came up with a list. And one of those values was gameplay clarity. And sort of the gist of gameplay clarity is that we want players to fight other players and not the game. And when we look at how players have been utilizing jungle timers, that is, you know, the timers we present currently, which are, you know, minimap icons, the chat logs, they're actually resorting to Notepad, mobile applications, and third-party programs to really make the best use of the jungle and play their best. And when we look at this situation, it's not really a situation we want, because we want the game itself to provide all of the tools necessary to play at the best competitive levels.
My problem with that is like every single player, maybe not necessarily Diamond or Challenger players or competitive players, but most players are going to want the game to be simpler. So where do you stop with making the game simpler for those players to digest?
I think it's also a little unfair to just say we're, you know, just making it simpler. Like the goal behind it is a bit more than that. We're trying to make sure that we have players focusing on the skills that, you know, they enjoy doing and that we feel like show what a League of Legends player really is. You know, dodging skill shots, aiming skill shots.
We want to stay away from rote sort of like bookkeeping behaviors.
Right, so like instead of focusing on when is dragon going to spawn, when should I check the chat log, and actually just thinking, where should I be at the right time? Is my team ready to fight this?
If you apply that train of thought at the same time, like the enemy's marksman's carry, like his flash is down, his summoners are down. So I want to know that. Why should I have to bookkeep that and like constantly log that his flash is down or his flash is up?
Yeah, it comes down to those things are a point of interaction between player and player, right? The jungle itself is a very static element. Like when Baron respawns, it's always going to be 7 minutes, and there's no variability there, right? You know it's going to respawn. Whereas when a champion flashes or a champion uses an item, there's no guarantee of something that's going to happen when that cooldown comes back up, right?
So when we made the decision to put red and blue buff on the jungle timers as well, where did we draw the line? Like, why didn't we include things like inhibitor timers or even the rest of the jungle camps?
Yeah, well, I think, you know, a good point there is that inhibitor timers are one of the things that we could consider doing in the future.
I'm more in favor of that. I'm more in favor of inhibitor timers than necessarily jungle timers. I've grown to kind of accept the jungle timer change, just with the kind of small changes that were made about the idea. But inhibitor timers, I think, are more primary than jungle timers, for example.
Right. That's the big thing for me, honestly, which is like every time we make a change to the game, we're always thinking about what is the actual result on the players, what's going to happen when we do it. And in this case, when we think about jungle timers specifically, giving people easier access to that information means people are going to be able to show up to buffs, show up to dragon, show up to baron, and create a lot of interesting moments in the game where they can interact and like make big plays. And so that's something that as designers really excites us.
What's going to tell them? Like now they have to be told to press tab and then look at the timers.
It being in tab, right? Anytime you do check your score, you do get to see, hey, when is Baron up? When is Dragon going to be up? And that's sort of our way of almost hiding it, but also keeping it very accessible. Like when you do check your score, you get that little glimpse of information. And from my point of view, it's not that much different from checking a chat log, but now the onus is on all of the players to understand, like when.
I don't understand the point where you make about we want to hide it, like slightly. I don't understand that, because if we want to be more transparent and like just give them this information that's already there, why would we slightly disguise it?
That's a really good question. It's not that we necessarily want to disguise it, but it's also like, hey, this is a big chunk of the UI. We don't want to always keep it up. Because when we do keep it up, right, it becomes a prescriptive element. You see a big countdown at the top of the screen, and you kind of understand, oh my gosh, countdown to 0, I better be there. And that's really not what we want to get to. What we do want to get to is like, hey, this is this optional information that you can make use of to make your own decisions.
Yeah. So let's go ahead and move on to Lucian. He's been consistently strong in competitive play, and I mean, especially in solo queue, I think. What is it about his kit that's so difficult to balance?
I mean, he's just a super well-rounded kit. He's a kit that has a lot of strengths, but not necessarily any weaknesses. He's got great damage. He's got great safety through mobility. And when you put that all together, you get a champion that can kind of react to any situation and not necessarily care, about what the enemy's doing or what he needs to do this game. It's just, I'm Lucian, and I have a great chance to win.
I'm Lucian.
Yeah.
He synergized really well with like any like aggro support, for example. He just synergized so well with, because those early levels he could punish you like really, really hard, because he could choose to go in, he could choose to go backwards. He could also push the wave like relatively fast compared to other ADs. So that early phase of the lane where it can be decided on whether you get level 2 first or whether you get level 3 first, he was very potent in that aspect.
So in giving him a weakness, we reduced his attack range, his Q cast range. Attack range is one of the most sensitive things that affects a marksman power. Why do we decide to make that his weakness?
It comes down to what do we perceive the core of Lucian to be? Because we're at a point where we have 100+ champions, and we need to make sure they're all different. They feel different. They provide something different to the game. Strategically, I think specifically is really important for like competitive. And so when it came down to it, he's got great damage, he's got great mobility. We had to find a way to make sure he had a weakness. He had something that people could exploit.
Exactly.
And so how do we increase the vulnerability in his kit? Well, we thought, if we could lower his range, maybe he can have a little bit harder time dealing with certain champions.
My problem is you didn't just lower the range, you cut it from like 550 to 500, which I think is pretty big.
It's severe, and we didn't take it lightly when we did it. I mean, like, we only did it because we were sure we wanted to amp up the strengths on the kit as well. I think we're going pretty crazy with the mobility we're giving him this patch. It's going to be really intense.
Yeah, and thematically and mechanically, right? It's really what we want to focus on to make this champion really distinct from all the other AD carries in the game, right? For example, using a mage as a sort of analog, right? Lux, she's got really good damage, and she's got really long range. And previously, she had really high movement speed as well, right? And when we look at what makes Lux Lux, is it that she's fast, or is it that she has really long range and she lasers you across the screen, right?
Pew pew.
And that's what we really want to do, we want to apply that to Lucian as well.
Right, so we gave him a lot more mobility with the cooldown reduction on his E. I actually was testing it out with 40% cooldown reduction, and he is just dashing all over the place, and I feel like that's actually going to buff his late game power a lot.
It's hard to tell. I mean, honestly, like, I think against certain matchups, he will be better, and in certain matchups, he might be worse still, because the range matters.
Yeah. One thing you have to question as well, like in the early game, if he's weaker in the laning phase because of the auto attack trading in lane, is he not going to translate into this mid-late game beast that he could be, because he just can't get out of the laning phase, as well as some other AD carries.
It's definitely something we were aiming for, though, because right now, you pick him in the laning phase, you feel like you're going to get through it, and so you're going to at least get through it.
And then get
sometimes you can just crush someone and just like run away with
the blade,
so I think with the new setup, he will crush some lanes, he might get crushed in some lanes, you know, especially ones with like range disadvantages
Caitlyn.
and stuff.
Yeah.
Caitlyn's going to be probably a nightmare matchup.
Already is, to be honest.
That's true.
Cool. So I do want to move on to Alistar before we run out of time. He's been a pretty low tier support pick in all levels of play, and I know that we're giving him better mana costs and better damage reduction on his ultimate at earlier ranks. What are our goals for actually giving him competitive viability, and how do these changes support that?
Just jungle Alistar coming back.
Well, that's complicated. That's complicated. So I mean, we've always designed, originally intended, Alistar to be a support champion. You know, he brings a lot of cool mechanics and big play potential from that position. You know, we've seen even like Afromu and some Korean pro players do some really cool stuff with him, and we really love that about him.
Or then a really crazy jungler.
Yeah, and that's actually the problem. Is I think. You know, a couple of years ago, we went back and remade his passive and had this idea that maybe he could be a jungler. And what ultimately fell out from that was we had to nerf things about him that were really abusive in the jungle that made him very weak in the support role. I mean, it's like the mana costs are a large example of that. He's someone who, from the jungle, doesn't really feel that fair to play against. He comes out and knocks you away from your tower and then like CCs you for like way
it's
too
like
long.
a free Malphite ultimate.
And you have no time to react to it. But in lane, you know, you can use the brush, you can see his positioning, you can react to him. And we think that's
one thing you have to take in mind, though, that I think people, when they glance over the patch notes, won't really realize is the mana reduction in Q and W. Sure, you can cast it more often in lane. But if you look at the 70% damage reduction at level 1 on his ultimate, if you combine that with the mana cost on Q and W, essentially when you engage at level 6, you can get off another QW rotation just because you have an extra 20% damage mitigation that you otherwise wouldn't have. And that can be really strong when you're like going for fights or when you're escaping ganks or things like that. And that's one of the things that people overlook a lot.
Okay, thanks guys. If you're looking for more information, definitely check out the patch notes. We'll be back in a couple of weeks, but until then, check out the link below and leave us your comments and questions.